Welcome back to the show, everyone. So in today's episode, we're going to be checking out the ICD-10-CM Guidelines for Section 1, Conventions, General Coding Guidelines, and Chapter-Specific Guidelines, but we'll be doing Part B, the General Coding Guidelines. So there are many different parts to this subpart here for Section B, for Section 1B, for the General Coding Guidelines. First thing we're going to discuss is locating a code in the ICD-10-CM, so in the coding book. So as we mentioned in the last part, that there's two parts of the diagnosis book, the front part and the back part. The front part is technically called the alphabetical index, but I like to call it the ABC index. And then the back part with all of the codes starting in alphabetical order with first character A all the way through Z and then now U at the end is the tabular list, which I tend to call the 1, 2, 3 index. So when we're locating a code in the ICD-10-CM in the diagnosis book, we go to the front of the book first, the alphabetical index. We choose the most generic term in the diagnosis that we have, and then we drop down, drill down, whichever way you want to call it, and then get more specific when we're dropping down. And then once we cannot drop down anymore based on the documentation, then we go to the back of the book, the tabular list, and verify the code. Not only to ensure that we have to the highest code specificity possible, as in up to, if it's going from 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 characters, but also to ensure that if there's any guidelines that we have to follow in the back of the book in the tabular list for that code. So a simple phrase, never code from the front of the book, always go to the back to verify the code. So part 1 here discusses locating a code in the ICD-10-CM. And then here we have a nice little chart where first we find the main term out in the alphabetical index in front. And then, is there an indented term that applies to your diagnosis? That means when you're dropping down and indenting over or drilling down, again, whatever you want to call it, is there an indentation, yes or no? If there is, then review the default code next to the indented term in the tabular list. Like we learned last time, the default code is when we look up the first term, whatever that code is next to the term. And then if there is the indentation, then we look at the default code, and then we review all notes and conventions in the alphabetical index and in the tabular list to verify that we have the correct code. And then also we verify the number of characters to ensure that we have the complete code. Because remembering that in the back of the book, in the tabular list, we'll have a 4th, a 5th, a 6th, or a 7th in a circle or a box, depending on what type of symbol the publisher uses, letting us know that we need additional codes. And I should say additional characters in that code. So if we see the 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th in a circle or a box next to the code, we don't stop there. We need additional characters in the code to build it up to the full code description. But now, like how the right part of the grid shows, that if there is no indentation when we're looking up the term in the alphabetical index in the front, then we still review the main term, and then review all notes, and then still check the number of characters. Again, make sure that we're building up to the full character length there. So now part number 2 here discusses the level of detail in coding, which I actually just kind of talked about a little bit in the last part. The diagnosis codes can go anywhere between 3 to 7 characters. And sometimes we do have a category, which is what we refer to as the first 3 characters of a code. Sometimes the category is a full diagnosis code. But again, just remembering that whenever we have the 4th TH, 5th TH, 6th TH, or 7th TH for 4th, 5th, 6th, or 7th next to the code, that means that it is not a valid code. We need additional characters to be able to build up to that full code that we need. And then part number 3 here discusses the coder codes from A00.0 through T88.9 and Z00 through Z99.8. That those codes must be used to identify the diagnosis, symptoms, conditions, problems, complaints, and or other reasons for the encounter visit. So simply put, we just choose the correct diagnosis code in those categories, in the ranges there, for whatever the patient is being seen for that particular encounter. Now part number 4 deals with signs and symptoms. So now, sometimes when we're reading the documentation, the provider may list the signs and or symptoms the patient may have. However, though, we do not code those if we have a definitive diagnosis. So when a definitive diagnosis is established, we don't code the signs and symptoms, we code that one or maybe multiple definitive diagnosis the patient has. Let's say, for example, a patient comes in with cough, fever, and chills, and then the doctor diagnoses the patient as having the flu or influenza. In that case, we would code the flu or the influenza. We would not code the cough, the fever, and the chills if the patient has that definitive diagnosis. Let's say, though, the provider is not able to give the definitive diagnosis. Maybe they're going to order some lab tests to rule out a condition. Or maybe a type of radiology exam to, again, rule out some type of condition or diagnosis. If the condition is not 100% definitive, then that is when we code the signs and symptoms. So as always, remember to not get those mixed up. Again, when we have, yes, a definitive diagnosis, we only code the definitive diagnosis, not its accompanying signs and symptoms. It's when the diagnosis is unknown, or as in it's not definitive, then that is when we would code the signs and or symptoms that the patient may have. And part number 5 deals with the conditions that are integral part of the disease process. And short little just guideline rule here, that signs and symptoms that are associated routinely with the disease should not be assigned as additional codes unless otherwise instructed by the classification. And that just kind of recaps what we actually just talked about. Because remember, I don't write the guidelines, so some of them are a little bit repetitive here. But it says that we should not assign the signs and symptoms diagnosis codes if we have that definitive diagnosis. And part number 6, conditions that are not an integral part of the disease process. And then again, short little guideline rule here. Additional signs and symptoms that may not be associated routinely with the disease process should be coded when present. So if the patient has a definitive diagnosis, but other signs and symptoms that are not associated or linked with that definitive diagnosis, we would code the definitive diagnosis, but then any additional signs or symptoms that the patient may have that's not part of that definitive. Because the patient could have a lot going on. So we code what's definitive. Any signs or symptoms that are not part of that definitive diagnosis, then we would be coding those signs and symptoms separately. And part number 7 here, this is actually a 2-part slide here, dealing with multiple coding for a single condition. And here's where we have the etiology comes in, or the manifestations, when we have 2 codes that describe a single condition that can affect multiple organ systems. And looking at the guideline rule here, it says that we use the phrase use additional code. Notes are found in the tabular list that are not part of the etiology or the manifestation pair when a secondary code is useful to fully describe the condition. The sequencing rule is the same as the etiology or manifestation pair, where use additional code indicates that a secondary code should be added if known. Because so it's like sometimes we need 2 different codes to fully describe, as far as the coding process, one condition that the patient has. And like the example shows right here in the guidelines, for an example, a bacterial infections that are not included in Chapter 1, secondary category, for example, we have B95 for Streptococcus, Staphylococcus, or Enterococcus as the cause of a disease classified elsewhere, or the B96. Other bacterial agents as the cause of the disease classified elsewhere. And there's a note that says that use additional code would normally be found at the infectious disease code, indicating that a need for the organism code to be added as a secondary code. So like an example, in this case, we have dealing with the, for example, say B95 for the Streptococcus. And certain conditions, we need an additional code to help clarify, as far as the coding process goes, what infection the disease that the patient's having, what organism there was involved in that. So sometimes, again, we will need 2 codes to explain one condition that the patient has. And just like we have the use additional code rule, with use additional code, that other code we need gets added onto the end, we have, remembering the code first rule, that the other code we need gets coded first. So when we have a single condition that requires multiple codes to correctly describe and code that condition, sometimes the other code we need is added on to the end, other times it gets coded first. So simply put that, remembering that whenever we need multiple codes to be able to fully describe one condition, double check the sequencing of it to make sure we get those done in the proper order. Now, number 8 here deals with acute and chronic conditions. So sometimes a condition can be described as both acute or also known as subacute, and chronic. And looking at the guidelines here, it says that when we have both of them, code both, and the sequencing as an acute goes first. So sometimes we have one code that says acute and chronic. Other times we don't, depending on the condition. So we'll need one separate code for the acute status and a second code for the chronic status. So when that occurs, we always code the acute first because that's more sudden, it's more recent, and then the chronic code would go second. But again, that's only when we are coding conditions where we, yes, sometimes have one code that's acute and chronic, but other times when we don't, we need, again, one code for acute and a second code for chronic. The acute always goes first for the sequencing, followed by the chronic code after that. Because then we have next also is combination codes. So based on the condition, a provider may have diagnosed the patient with one condition. Okay, there's a diagnosis code, but maybe now they have a second condition. There's a second diagnosis code. But depending on what conditions are having diagnosed at the same time, sometimes though there's the combination code where if you have the one condition, you code it separately. You have a second condition by itself, you would code it separately. However, though, based on maybe the manifestations or the complications, then the patient can have two separate conditions, but one diagnosis code. And not every combination, as far as diagnoses, have a combination code. It's just that whenever the patient has the two conditions going on at the same one time, then we would use that combination code when we're assigning it. But again, that's only if the patient has both those two conditions at the one single time. If they don't have both of them, then we cannot use the combination code. We would use whatever appropriate separate individual diagnosis code the patient would have. Because now we also have, which when we switched ICD-10, October 1, 2015, they changed the term late effect to sequela. Basically just kind of spiced it up a little bit. But a sequela is what we used to call late effect. Basically, it's a residual effect that after the acute phase, after the patient's injured, or after they have some type of illness, that is terminated. And like the guidelines show here, there's no timeline as far as the sequela or the late effect has to occur within 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, or anything like that. It's just a residual effect that occurs after a patient has a condition. Like we have an example here in the guidelines. Let's say that the patient is burned and then a scar develops from it, and a deviated septum, for example, due to a nasal fracture, or a patient has old tuberculosis and then they have an infertility due to a tubal occlusion. Basically anything that shows that cause and effect relationship, that is an example of a sequela or a late effect. And then we also have impending or threatening. Now, this is something with a watch out for because sometimes it's very rare, but when we're doing the dropping down or the drilling down in front, sometimes though, in the alphabetical index by in front, sometimes we have a drop down option for impending or threatening condition. Now, if it did occur, we would actually code it as a confirmed diagnosis. However, though, if that condition did not occur, like per here the guidelines, we need to determine if the patient does not have that condition, but they're possible, if the ducks are starting to all line up in a row where they could actually develop that condition. Then when we're doing the drop downs from the most generic term in the alphabetical index in front to getting more specific, when we're dropping down, if they have the option for impending or threatening on those drop downs on the subterms, then we would choose that. But if they don't have those drop downs available, then we would just code the existing underlying condition and not the condition described as impending or threatening. So again, just kind of recap this because this is kind of unique. So again, that when we have the drop downs available, if the patient does not have the condition, but they may get it, as in they're threatening to have it or impending, possibly they're going to get it. When we have the drop downs available for that impending option or threatening option, then we choose that correct impending or threatening option. But it's just when they don't have that option, then we just don't do any coding. It does not impact the coders for our code selection. And we have a little chart here to look at it. So looking at the top part of the chart and going down. So first we have the provider documents a pending condition. And then we drop down, did the condition occur during the visit? If it did occur, then we report it as a confirmed or a definitive diagnosis. If it did not occur during the visit, then we review the sub-entries and main terms for impending or threatened. And then drop down. If we have that option for impending or threatening, if we do, then we review the code in the tabular list. So we have the code from the front, impending or threatening. We go to the back to verify the code. But if we do not have the drop down available, then reporting the existing underlying conditions and not the condition described in the impending or threatened. Simply just what we just went over, but just a nice little chart here instead. And next we have reporting for part number 12 here, reporting the same diagnosis code more than once. We don't do that. Simply put, that every single individual diagnosis code can only be reported once on the claim form. And now, let's say if the patient has similar conditions, so the codes are really close to one another, but they're different, then we can still code them if they're different. But no matter, let's say if a patient has and I'll just use my hands here since I can put them on camera. Let's say a patient has a condition on their left wrist and a condition on their right wrist. If there's no code selection for laterality, left or the right side, so it's just one code for the wrist and that's it, even though they have the condition twice, your wrists don't touch one another normally, then we would not code the same code twice, just code it one time and that's it. So, and then laterality, left side, right side, and bilateral both sides. And I almost face palmed on this one, but I decided just to scratch my eyebrow instead. Sometimes, quite often, when we have the diagnosis codes, when we're looking them up, we have options for left side, right side, bilateral side, or unspecified. I mean, we don't know. And depending on if the patient has a condition on both sides, I'm showing my wrist for some reason, but if the patient has a condition on both sides, and if the documentation shows, let's say, bilateral, and we have a bilateral code to choose from, then we choose the one bilateral code. Again, if we have it. Meaning if the condition is existing, same condition is existing on both sides, and there's a bilateral code available. But then it says then for the second encounter for treatment, after one side has previously been treated and the condition no longer exists on that one side, then we use the correct unilateral code. So let's say a patient has a condition on bilaterally, let's say on a patient's wrist, and then let's say then the right side clears up, but the left side does not. Patient comes back in for a follow-up visit, so right side diagnosis is gone, only has it now on the left side. Then we would choose the appropriate left-sided for the laterality. We would not choose the bilateral code anymore because patient does not have the condition bilaterally anymore, just on the left side. But like it does notate though, and like I mentioned before, oftentimes, most of the time, we have bilateral codes available, and they have gotten better over the years on adding bilateral codes in. But not every condition, when there's a separate left side and right side as far as the code options, unfortunately, not every time do we have a bilateral code available. So when no bilateral code is available to choose from, but then the patient is diagnosed as having it bilaterally, then we choose the separate. So then we have to do two codes. We have to choose one code for the left side and one code for the right side. But again, we only do that if no bilateral code is available. And then part number 14 here, we're over halfway done, so don't worry. But part number 14 here, 2 slides on this part, for documentation by clinicians other than the patient's provider. And this is where we have to watch out for who's doing the documentation, whose notes are in there. As the guidelines state, code assignment is based on the documentation by the patient's provider, and there are a few exceptions as far as what documentation a non-doctor can put in. For example, like the BMI, the body mass index, the depth of a non-pressure chronic ulcer, pressure ulcer stage, a coma scale, the NIH stroke scale, or the NIHSS codes. And those codes assigned may be based on the medical record documentation for clinicians and not on the doctor level, not on the provider level itself. And then we're looking to here at the guidelines that associated diagnosis, such as, for example, a patient being overweight, obesity, acute stroke, or pressure ulcer, must be documented by the patient's provider. If there is conflicting medical record documentation either from the same clinician or different clinicians, the patient's attending physician should be queried for classification. Because remember, that's one thing that when patients go to the doctor's office, most of the time they'll see a doctor at some point, but generally they're like a nurse will bring them back from the waiting area. If it's for example, like an in-person visit, they'll have you step on that scale, and I swear every time it's always broken. It always adds, I don't know, 5, 10 more pounds, I think. That's just how I think scales work at doctor's offices. They're going to put that in the documentation and in your chart. And when you go back to the room, the nurse will ask you a few questions. They'll put that information in the chart, but then the doctor should be coming in. And so then if there's conflicting information when we're coding it based on what the nurse put in and put it in the documentation, and then what the doctor put in afterwards, as far as the coders, we have to ask the doctor, hey, what's going on? These things are conflicting. What's correct? And oh, by the way, I need to make an addendum to state that whatever part is correct there. But then we also have social determinants for health, such as the categories Z55 through Z65. Persons with potential health hazards related to socioeconomic or psychosocial circumstances. The codes may be based on the medical record documentation from clinicians involved in the patient's care who's not the doctor, her, or himself. Because that information that's given, it's social information, and it's not the doctor performing an exam on the patient and giving some type of a medical diagnosis for the patient. Now, remembering that the patients can self-report information, no matter what it is, as far as if there's Epic. I know because my doctor uses Epic, and they have an app. I think it's called MyChart. I could be wrong, but Epic has an example in an app. But when I check in for my visit within like 24 hours, I believe, in advance, I can fill out some historical questions on there, and the doctor doesn't have to go back in and re-ask me all those questions. They just need to review it and sign off on it. But then, of course, if there's any questions based on what the patient provided on that self-documentation, then the doctor should ask questions to clarify anything that could possibly be conflicting as far as what the patient entered into the system. And then next up, number 15, we have good old syndromes. So when we're looking at the alphabetical index in front, when we're coding syndromes, we simply just look in the ABC index in front and look up syndromes and then do the normal drop downs. But like it says here in the guidelines, that when we do not have the alphabetical index, again, the index in front for the guidance, then we have to assign codes for the documentation manifestations of that individual syndrome. And additional codes for manifestations that are not an integral part of the disease process may also be assigned when the condition does not have a unique individual code. Again, we're almost done here. I know this is a nice chunk of information also. Just like the last episode was a little bit longer than normal. But the part A and part B here are good chunks of the basics when we're looking at the guidelines. Because part number 16 here deals with when we're having the documentation of complications of care. And looking at the guidelines here, says that code assignment is based on the provider's documentation of the relationship when the condition and the care or procedure, unless otherwise instructed by the classification. The guideline extends to any complications of care, regardless of the chapter that it's located in. It is important to note that not all conditions that occur during or following medical care or surgery are classified as complications. There must be a cause and effect relationship between the care provided and the condition, and an indication in the documentation that it is a complication. Query the doctor if you have any questions if the complication is not clearly documented. So just kind of basically translating that when we're looking up the documentation, we have to watch out for any complications. But the main thing is, though, for us to be able to classify it as a complication, it has to be the correct cause and effect relationship. If we think something is a complication, but if it's not caused by another condition, then yes, it's a condition, but it's not actually a complication of another one. Again, just always, no matter what it is, but when we're coding, we're not doctors, we're not nurses, we don't play them on TV, most likely, I'm going to assume. We don't have any TV stars here on medical shows watching this. If we do, awesome, cool. Please send me a message and let me know. But even if we are, we're not seeing the patient, so we should query the provider if we need to have any clarification on is this a complication or not. Now, part number 17 here deals with borderline diagnoses, and this is I just call it a unique term, if you will, because like the guidelines show, that if the provider documents something as a borderline diagnosis when the patient's discharged, the diagnosis is coded as confirmed unless the classification provides a specific entry. For example, dropping down and say borderline. So when a patient is being discharged, if they have that diagnosis as notated as borderline, so if we, as coders, if we said that word borderline, we code it as a definitive diagnosis. That as in like, I don't like to say the phrase pretend, I almost just said that out loud, but we just assume, if you will, that it is a confirmed diagnosis. Because if the borderline condition has a specific index in the ICD-10-CM, then it should be coded as a borderline diagnosis. Because borderline diagnoses are technically uncertain, and there's no distinct clarification between an inpatient, like in the hospital side, or on the outpatient side. But when the documentation is unclear regarding a borderline condition, then again, we're always supposed to query the provider if we're not 100% sure that it is a borderline diagnosis. But simply put though, just kind of recap the borderline because it is a unique type, that when a diagnosis is documented as being borderline, when the patient's discharged, if they have the drop-down option for borderline, for example, diabetes has a drop-down for borderline, we would choose that option. But if it's uncertain, because borderline conditions are technically uncertain diagnoses, then it doesn't matter when we're coding inpatient or outpatient, we still use the same guidelines there. And we have part number 18 and part number 19. So part number 18 here, use of signs, symptoms, and unspecified codes. And just like we had for section 1, part A, we had some redundancy there. We have some redundancy here in section 1, part B, because we already really just discussed the signs and symptoms and unspecified codes. But just to be redundant, because that's what they have us do in the guidelines here, that when we have signs or symptoms, so when we have signs and or symptoms in our diagnosis, then we choose the definitive diagnosis if we have it. So a patient comes in with signs and symptoms, the doctor gives the patient a definitive diagnosis. We code that definitive diagnosis if the patient definitely has it. We would not code any of the signs and symptoms. The only time we would code the signs and symptoms is if the patient has not been definitely told what they have by the doctor. Again, maybe the doctor is ordering some lab tests or some radiology tests to rule out a certain condition. Then we would not code that unknown or suspected condition that they're trying to rule out. We would only code the signs and symptoms until we have that definitive diagnosis. And then we also have unspecified codes in the ICD-10 book, which generally end in the number 9 most of the time that they do. Most as in a majority. But then based on the documentation, and I don't like saying this phrase, but I'll say it out loud. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. We hear that phrase a lot and when we're coding, but we want to code to the highest specificity possible based on that documentation that we have. And simply put, if we have crappy documentation, then we're not going to get very descriptive in our code selection. So that'd be an example of maybe we can get to the category that we need, but we have to choose on a specified code because we know what condition the patient has, but it's very generic as far as the description and the documentation. So then we have to choose an unspecified code. So again, so maybe we can get in the area as maybe again like the category, the first 3 characters of a code. After that, we don't know more specificity, so we have to choose an unspecified code in that individual category. Now, something I do think I don't know why, but I think it's unique that part 19 here. So section 1, part B for general coding guidelines, and then the subterm 19 actually has 19 A, B, C, and D. And it's all dealing with coding for healthcare encounters in hurricane aftermath. And unless if you live somewhere in the country or code for someone in the country that has hurricanes, you may never have to deal with this. But looking at the guidelines here, that when we have the external cause codes of morbidity, so those storytelling codes, if you will, that we always have to use a external cause of morbidity code to identify the cause of the injury that occurred. Remember, because that could also depending on the type of insurance that has to switch to. Let's say from personal insurance to work comp to auto carrier or homeowners or renters insurance, for example. So for the purpose of capturing the complete diagnosis codes for aftermath and hurricane, a healthcare setting should be considered any location where medical care is provided by a licensed healthcare provider. So even though the patient may not be physically in the hospital, rather we do have place of service codes that are not just hospital based, and that's how we would choose the diagnosis code for the external cause code of it, wherever the patient's being seen after a hurricane would happen. And then sequencing for those external cause or morbidity codes, again, dealing with the hurricanes. So for cataclysmic events such as a hurricane, they take priority over all other external cause codes, except for child and adult abuse and terrorism, and should be sequenced before other external cause codes. So simply put, patients involved in a hurricane, those X codes for the external causes would come first before any other external cause codes, unless if the patient is also suffering from child or adult abuse or a terrorism code is involved, then only the adult and child abuse or the terrorism codes would go before the hurricane external cause code. If not, hurricane external cause code goes before everything else. So it's all just based on the sequencing there. And then part C, other external causes or morbidity code issues. And for injuries that are not a direct result of a hurricane, such as an evacuee that has injured in an accident, or as a result of a motor vehicle accident, assign the appropriate external causes of morbidity to describe the cause of injury, but do not assign a hurricane code. Because, again, just to repeat that, if the hurricane itself did not cause the injury, but something happened after the hurricane, well, maybe after the aftermath, or say during the aftermath, if you will, of the hurricane, then we would not choose the X37.0 for character codes for hurricane, since a hurricane did not directly hurt the patient, something else would. So for example, that W54.0, bitten by a dog, X30, exposure to excessive natural heat, or X31, exposure to excessive natural code, or X38, flood. And so if a patient is not injured during the hurricane itself, but is injured during the aftermath, so the time period after a hurricane, then we would not choose the appropriate X37 external cause code for hurricane. We would choose whatever other injuries, because the hurricane itself did not directly hurt the patient. It was something that happened after the hurricane. And then the last part then we have on the hurricanes, because how often and how long can we talk about hurricanes, is using the Z codes. And it says that the Z codes may be assigned as an appropriate code to further explain the reasons for presenting for healthcare services, including transfer between healthcare facilities. So for example, that if the patient has any other condition that developed after the hurricane, because with the diagnosis codes, as far as the primary diagnosis code guidelines, notice though it says that the guidelines itself that we're discussing here, it identifies which codes can be listed as primary or the first diagnosis, and which ones can only be secondary diagnosis. And possible Z codes though, example, we have Z59.0, homelessness, Z59.1, inadequate housing, and so forth, that it depends on which of the codes can be listed first and which codes can be listed second. Because normally these Z codes are not primary diagnoses, and just in general. Like it says at the bottom though, the external cause of morbidity codes and the Z codes listed above are not an all-inclusive list. Other codes applicable to the encounter based upon the documentation, and we would assign as many codes in the Z categories as possible based on whatever the documentation shows to be able to fully describe that encounter that the patient has. So with the identifying the primary listed diagnosis codes, a lot of publishers will have a symbol next to the Z codes that will state like acceptable primary diagnosis code, for example. Remember, a patient can come in, they have no medical conditions going on, but they can still come in for a visit, like a wellness care visit, for example, and just have Z codes if the patient has no medical conditions going on. So that's one thing, just again, now in this case, wrapping up the encounters for after a hurricane, so during the hurricane aftermath, that when we have Z codes that describe the patient, check to see if that applicable Z code is being able to list as the primary diagnosis. So that wraps up our education on Section 1, Part B for the General Coding Guidelines. And next up on our third part of 27 on our ICD-10-CM series for the guidelines, we will start looking at chapter-specific guidelines. So next up on the Paul Chandler Show here, we'll be looking at Chapter 1 for the ICD-10-CM book. That goes from all of the A codes and the first half of the B codes. So again, so from all of the cast and crew here of the Paul Chandler Show, we do thank you for watching. Live long, do good, and prosper.